So speaking of love, when we have been introduced to this whole Global South movement, it was really about 25 years ago that we started going to Design Indaba, which, as many of you know, was the best design conference in the world every February. At this time of year, actually, we would be there in Cape Town, not just with people from all over Africa, but really from all over the world. And it was at this conference that we met Sunny Dolat, who is not only an amazing creative director and working with the best talent in African fashion, but he's also working as a fashion curator and was one of the contributors to the African fashion exhibition at the V&A recently. Sunny, you also wrote a book called Not African Enough. So I hope you have time to mention a little bit about what this book is all about, because I haven't read it yet. But thank you so much for being with us. I guess you're in Nairobi today, or I'm not sure if you're traveling.
I'm home in Nairobi, and it's the sun's gotten really, really bright, so I apologize that I look very brightly lit. Um, but thank you, Lee and Philip, for your very kind invitation to join you this afternoon. Thank you to Jackie and Madupe for their really wonderful perspectives and information that they shared with us. I think it's always really inspiring to hear the perspectives and the work of peers from across the continent. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank them for that. Um, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Which, okay, I think you can see the screen. For some reason, it's not going into full screen, but I think we'll just proceed with it as is. My name is Sunny Dolat. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work as a curator, artist, and researcher, which for me for a long time felt like a very unusual mix of things to do. But as I've continued to work within this space, I think increasingly I'm starting to realize that how all of these things inform each other. I also have a bit of a background in finance. So the fund, Heva Fund, that Modupe mentioned, is a fund where I work as a partner, as part of the founding team. So 13 years later, which is again kind of insane to vocalize. Yeah, it's grown to be quite an important financial vehicle in the region, but also across the continent. When I was thinking about today's session and kind of what to speak about, I thought about many things, and then I kind of went back to an article that um, was written for a digital magazine called Wowzine that I contributed to last year. And so we commissioned this piece from a Kenyan writer called Wanjeri Gakuru. And within it, Wanjeri wrote a really beautiful, beautiful statement, and I'll read it out loud. And she says, the best part of being an active protagonist is the ability to, and I can't see the rest of it, to remake one's own world. It comes with opportunities to introduce fresh and refined ideas, to complicate how one is seen and received. And ever since I read that article, I've really been this idea of complicating um, for me is really compelling because I think for way too long, Africa and much of the global south has always suffered from the issue of a single story. I think for those of you who are familiar with Chimamanda Adichie's really popular TED Talk, which is called The Danger of a Single Story, Chimamanda really demonstrates and captures so poetically how dangerous it is for a people, a place to be limited by a single story, sometimes and quite often not necessarily defined by them. And that's certainly the case for the African continent, is that the narrative that exists and that is sort of like peddled around the world is a narrative that wasn't crafted by us. It's an incredibly narrow and limiting narrative. And so I really see my work and the work of all my peers across the continent, creatives and academics, as an effort and as this labor of complicating how we are seen and perceived. And so I just wanted to sort of like open with that quote. before delving into some of the work that I do. I wanted to give a little bit of a snapshot of some of the work that I do and some of the things that are dear to my heart, both aesthetically, but also narratively and conceptually. I started out working in fashion about 19 years ago. Started out working as a stylist and grew into production design, and working as a creative director, and now working as a curator. As I continue to grow within this space, I'm still at, like at the bottom of my heart, I'm still such a huge fan of image making and fashion photography, and so quite often I always return because I think it really is my first love. And throughout my career, I've always been really intentional in making work and collaborating with African designers from across the continent. Because for me, there's a really unique opportunity to craft these visual narratives of what design from the continent looks like. Again, going back to the single narrative, I think the global perception of what African design looks like, again, is quite narrow. I think there's a tendency to only think that African design is extremely colorful and extremely like print focused. But while that may be true, I also think that it's important for a continent as large and diverse as Africa to have room for varied expression of what this representation of this African identity can look like. And so through this image making, for me, it's always really important to expand and really challenge what people's notions and ideas of what African design looks like. And so on this slide, we have three images from three different projects from three very different years. The first image is a campaign for a jewelry designer called Capoeira, who's based in Nairobi. The second image was for actually um, the same issue where when Jury's article that I mentioned came from, which is Wowsy issue 5. And then the last image is from a Kenyan jewelry designer, actually adornment maker, I think is a better term, called Amido Shisha, who's a longtime collaborator and a good friend. And this is kind of one of the newer pieces of work that I've worked on, which is an editorial campaign for Industry Africa, which is an e-commerce platform that's based on the continent and retailed the works of various incredible African designers from across the continent, as well as the diaspora. So maybe just to quickly mention, like on the top image, we have Andrea Yama, who's a Nigerian designer, and Adele Dejac, who's a Kenyan Nigerian designer. We have This Is Us to the right, Nigerian brand, with jewelry from Patrick Mavros from Zimbabwe and Sidai Design from Tanzania. And below that, we have these two really beautiful embroidered tops from Babayo, who's a Nigerian designer based in the US. I'll maybe spare you all the details. The full editorial is on Industry Africa, and it's just industryafrica.com. And that's also from Wowzine. And maybe to shift gears a little bit. So the book that Philip referenced is a book called Not African Enough, which I published in 2017. And again, for me, Not African Enough was really an opportunity to challenge and to invite a moment to expand what the global perception and ideas of what African fashion aesthetics are. Kenya is a former British colony, and not only were we a British colony, we were a settler colony. And so the way that we were colonized was really quite different from other parts of the continent. And I think that whenever people come to Kenya, there's always this expectation of how people are going to dress. And I think quite often people are quite surprised at how conservative Kenyans can be when it comes to their dressing. And that has been quite challenging for designers working in Kenya and kind of trying to gain an international market and also a continental market, because quite often they find the aesthetic of their work and the perspective and point of view of their work being interrogated and then being disqualified as not African enough. On the left-hand side, we have these two really beautiful pieces by a Kenyan designer called Kefa Maina, who sadly has closed his practice and taken a break. But I think what for me was always so beautiful about Kefa's practice is that Kefa trained as an architect, and he really took that study of architecture and used it in the construction of the clothing. And you can see it in the way that he's able to manipulate fabrics and create some of the most amazing pleats and shapes and silhouettes. And in many ways, Kefa's practice is so representative of Kenyan design sensibilities that there tends to be a bit more of a focus on technical details as opposed to color. And so from a color perspective, you see this restraint that's sort of like implemented by the designers. But then when it comes to the technical detailing, there's such a joy in experimentation. And so this just in case someone is asking, the book is out of print. I think we went out of print in 2021 or 2020. We're considering doing a second run or maybe expanding the book a little bit. But yeah, when it's out, I think we'll post it and you'll be able to access it. Some of my work is also I'm really interested in advocacy, not only for advocating for African creative talent and African design, but also for better systems. In 2020, we presented a work, a documenta in Castle called Return to Sender, which is the work that you see on the left. And Return to Sender is a work that we developed to critique the movement of secondhand clothing from the global north into the global south. Someone who was born and raised in Kenya, the reality of secondhand clothing is something that I've grown up with all my life. And it's always been really surprising to me that in the global north, there isn't necessarily the same awareness of the consequence of secondhand clothing when it arrives within our borders. And so for decades, we've had to contend with not only this economic devastation, because the secondhand clothing comes into the country at such a low price that local brands and manufacturers are completely unable to compete with it. And so you're able to go into the market and buy a pair of jeans for $1, sometimes even less. And there's just simply no local brand or manufacturer who can compete with that price point. But most importantly, we're also having to contend with a devastating environmental impact. Over the past decade, with the rise of consumption of fast fashion in the global north, it's meant that consequently, most of the bales of secondhand clothing that are coming into the global south are bales of secondhand fast fashion. And I think that we can all agree that as new items, fast fashion are already of questionable quality at best. And so you can only imagine the state at which they arrive in within our borders. And so the largest dump site in Nairobi is a dump site called Dandora. And Dandora was declared full, I think, about 12 years ago. But the city has expanded to its limits. And so there's nowhere else for the landfill to expand to. And so every morning, trucks and trucks and literally hundreds of trucks continue to dump there because there's nowhere else for all of this waste to go. And so this work kind of invites a bit of a dialogue and critique around this movement of secondhand clothing and invites the audiences to reflect on who actually benefits from the movement of secondhand clothing, because I think the language that's used to justify and encourage the donation of secondhand clothing is this language of assistance and aid. But then what that same language then does is create this sort of like guilt-free system for the global north to continue this cycle of vicious consumption with the knowledge that they can just send it off to the global south because there's someone in need who wear it. So before I go down too much of a rabbit hole, I'll speak a little bit about the work on the right, which is a little bit more of a speculative work. And so within my artistic practice, I'm also really interested in design futures and speculative design. I think as an African creative, I am fully aware of the tremendous privilege that I have in terms of the heritage that I can access in terms of materials and artisanal knowledge. But then at the same time, I also feel a certain level of responsibility and maybe duty is, I think, a better term, to evolve and engage with these knowledges and with these materials and to evolve them and adapt them to perhaps a slightly more contemporary use. And so I have this ongoing body of work, which was first presented actually at Design Indaba, where I met Lee and Philip, around these speculative textiles, these sacred textiles, which invite us to think about what we consider sacred, especially outside of spiritual and religious practice in this day and age, but also around materiality and knowledge. A little bit about my curatorial work. Again, similarly, I continue and I'm dedicated to always being an advocate for African designers and African design. And so I started my curatorial practice about back in 2016, so 9 years now. But I think some of the most significant exhibitions that I've been a part of was obviously the Africa Fashion Museum, the Africa Fashion Exhibition, which opened at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2022 and has been on tour ever since. And for me, the Africa Fashion Exhibition was such a beautiful moment, again, to challenge and to expand what the perceptions of African design are. That, yes, we can look back at the history of design, but we can also look forward by looking at the work of contemporary designers and what they're proposing. So people like Tongoro and people like Tebe and people like Sally Rabi, and look at their points of view and the ways that they are communicating and expressing the African identity that I think are so special. Last year, I was part of the curatorial team for the State of Fashion Biennial, which we were able to present in 4 different sites. So Nairobi, the home site in Arnhem, Bengaluru in India, and the last site was Sao Paulo in Brazil. And for the Nairobi site, we really focused on the idea of the traditional. And so thinking about traditional knowledge, traditional practice, traditional systems, and traditional aesthetics, and how we engage with them and how we adapt them to the sort of like modern time that we're living in. And I think for me, with that exhibition, what I really wanted to capture and what I wanted to express and what I wanted to honor was the work and the labor of designers who are keeping these traditions alive, because I don't think that designers are often credited with the custodianship of knowledge that they carry. Because I think so much of knowledge and craft requires a certain level of financial incentive to keep going. And so this is the labor and this is the custodianship that designers do without credit. And so for me, it was really a moment to honor everything and the labor that designers do rather effortlessly, I think. Another 2 exhibitions that are perhaps a bit more research focused. And so last year showed a research preview for a project called Fashioning a Nation that really looks at the archive as a source of navigating and accessing identity, because Kenya has a really complex and painful colonial past. Quite often we find ourselves having to visit the archives to piece together our identities. And to my knowledge, no one has ever really quite done that from a fashion perspective. And so I really wanted to look at what I've been calling kind of like the liberation years. So just before independence to just after independence, and the ways that people were thinking about nationhood at the time, and the ways in which the Kenyan identity was being constructed through design. And so this is very much an ongoing piece of work that will most likely culminate around 2026, 2027. Yeah, and that was shown last year. And I know that we're out of time, so I'll just jump to the next slide and say thank you. Thank you for joining us this Sunday afternoon, and thank you for listening.
Well, you really carry your name perfectly well. You made our Africa very sunny with especially beautiful words, beautiful notions, new ways of describing things, very deep understanding of what is going on, not only in Africa, but in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lee.